Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome.
Afternoon, everybody.
I'm Jeff Garrett, Dean of the Wharton School, and this is, we have a fantastic Dean's lecture series, which was endowed in the honor of Mickey Tarnopol, a fantastic Wharton alum and a real friend of the university. And I couldn't be happier than to have a very special guest with us this afternoon, Wendell Pritchett, who's the provost of the University of Pennsylvania. And Wendell just asked me, this is not a particularly heavily scripted event. Wendell just asked me what I hope to get out of the event today. And I gave Wendell a non-negative answer, a double negative kind of answer, which is, I promise we're not going to grill you on what you're doing as provost and what the priorities of the provost are. But
wouldn't be the first time.
I know, but this is not, I think I build this to you as not that kind of event where you're not accountable for things at the university, but I think it will be important for us to get to how you think about the job and how you think about leadership. Yeah. But I don't want to do a long introduction of Wendell other than to say he's both the provost and a presidential professor at the university, and I'll ask you a little bit about the presidential professors program. Yep. Which is about diversifying the faculty maybe later on. But in lieu of a formal introduction of Wendell, I want to sort of go through the chronology of Wendell's life because it's an extraordinary life. But you're a pretty rare person in the upper reaches of administration at the university and probably in the faculty as a whole, in that you're a Philly boy.
It's true.
Right?
Yeah.
You grew up in Philadelphia, and as a result, you've seen the city change enormously over your life. So if you go back to when you were a kid, I know that you knew about the university, but give me high-level reflections both on the Philadelphia you grew up in and what the university meant to the city back then as opposed to today.
Yeah, thank you for asking. So first of all, thanks for coming. There are a lot of people in here who have heard me speak a lot of times, so I don't really know why you're here.
The pressure's on me to make it not exactly the same as all your previous events. I'm sure I'll fail that one, but I'll do my best.
No, you won't. And I'm pleased for those of you that I haven't met. Thank you for coming. And those of you that I have met, thanks for coming. And I also want to say, I looked at the history, since I'm a historian, of this lecture, and it's a pretty august group of people that I'm not sure that I appropriately fit within, but I'm happy and flattered to be among them. So now I'll finally answer your question. So let me just give a couple of bio points around Philadelphia and then really dig into your question. So I was born in Philadelphia. Both my parents, Philadelphians, I think they were both born in Philadelphia. My dad might have been born in Baltimore and then moved here early. Both my parents are public school teachers. They actually met at West Philadelphia High School right up the street where they taught together. It's a wonderful story. Their wedding picture was in the yearbook because the students were so happy. And then the next year, there's a picture of me as a baby in the yearbook. And so, yes, Philadelphia. I've been here for a long time. I'll mention a couple other things about Philadelphia and its complicated history. But I guess the first thing to answer the Dean's question is, so I grew up mostly in Center City, Philadelphia, but most of my family was in West Philadelphia. So one of my earliest experiences with Penn is just driving through it to get from my house to my grandparents'
When
house.
you could drive straight down Locust Street, right?
Yes, we did that early. But actually, even that's an interesting story. So I do remember doing that.
Yep.
I more remember driving up Spruce Street, but here's what I really remember.
By the way, for people who aren't aware, next time you go on Locust Walk, it was a street until 1965. Was it the year? So you would have been a baby.
Yeah, I was a baby, but I do remember when it was being turned into Locust Walk.
Yeah. Just imagine that when there were cars down the middle of Locust Walk. That was a transformative thing for the university, I presume.
An understatement, I think, yeah. But interesting thing also about transformation, we would drive up Spruce Street often to get to my grandmother's in West Philadelphia, but actually we stopped doing that by the 70s also because of Penn's construction. And instead we would turn left on 34th and then go through what's now the medical complex. A piece of advice, don't do that today because you'll get stuck in traffic and you'll be there forever because it's such a popular place. But when I was a kid, almost none of those buildings were there, to get to your question. And actually I remember Philadelphia General Hospital took up a large part of the complex. So if you think about where Penn Medicine is now and CHOP is now, Philadelphia General Hospital, which was a public hospital owned by the city, which was mostly for poor people and mostly for African Americans who were excluded from lots of other hospitals, including the University of Pennsylvania Hospital, by the way. And so there's Pennsylvania General Hospital, a Veterans Hospital, a gigantic lawn, and the Philadelphia Convention Center. And none of those things are there now. And in fact, there are over, I think you probably know, over 20,000 people who work in just the medical complex over there. So thinking about the transformation of the university, I mean, that's the first thing that I think about. And just to answer, say a couple other things about my connection to Penn. And my connections to Penn are deep and longstanding. So I had the privilege of going to a Quaker school downtown called Friends Select. And I had a class of 51 students, and 8 of my classmates had dads, and it was all dads, who taught at Penn. So I've had a lot of interaction with Penn from a very early age, to answer your question.
But you're a political animal. So in the 70s, you know, what do we know about Philadelphia? I think the world knows Rocky. Mm-hmm. The more political world knows a corrupt and close to bankrupt government. But I don't know, were you aware of the role of the university in the city back then? Was the university part of the city? Was it apart from the city? I mean, I'm sure it's hard to segment. Yeah. But what's
it's hard for me to divide what I experienced as a young person and what I've studied as an academic. And so adding those two things together, I would say that the university, and also my experience as provost in meeting literally thousands of alumni, and them sharing their stories with me too. Penn has had a long and deep connection with the city of Philadelphia. And I would compare Penn to some of our peers and say it's had a much more, relative to our peers, a much more productive relationship with the city over a long time. Certainly lots of challenges, certainly lots of conflicts and disconnects, but compared to our peers, I would say that it's been a much more productive relationship. So that's one part to answer your question. Secondly, Penn has played a big role in just educating the leaders of the city of Philadelphia. I
worked for Michael Nutter.
I worked for Mayor Michael Nutter, who went to Penn. And that's been true for a long time.
Proud Wharton alum, as we like to say here.
And he's very proud of it.
Right, which is part of the university, I believe.
He talks about that a lot, though he often also says, I'm not sure how much I learned about business, because, you know, he didn't go to class often, he said this.
Yeah, right.
But anyway, he's a proud Wharton alum. And the business community, you know, being a law professor, I interact with lots of law alums. And while today, actually, we send law alums all over the world, for most of the Penn Law School's history, most of the alums stayed in Philadelphia. So really, the leadership of the city came from Temple and Penn, and a meaningful part of it came from Penn.
In the way the university's history has been related to me, I'm sure what you said is true, but big university investment, particularly physically in West Philadelphia, was a signature part of Judy Rodin's presidency, who had come from Yale, where Yale's relationship with New Haven is notoriously not good, and doesn't look like it succeeded like this. So I think you were probably first on the faculty when Judy was still president, right? Mm-hmm. Do you remember that feeling? I mean, rather than building barriers to the community, Penn was building bridges in lots of senses. You know, I know this is what you study, urban development, urban renewal. What does that period stand out, or you think it was more of a straight line over time of the university's engagement in West Philadelphia in particular?
No, that period stands out. And now I've already said that I think that the university has, for a long time, had a productive, if complicated, relationship with Philadelphia. And I do believe that. I'll now talk about some of the negative parts of the relationship with Philadelphia, and then come back to your question about why I really do think that Judy's presidency was transformative in a positive way for the university. So I teach property, land use regulation, urban policy, housing. And one of the many topics that come up in that context is a thing called eminent domain. How many people know what eminent domain is? Anybody know what? Okay. So if you don't, eminent domain is the legal process by which the government can take your property Now, they have to pay you compensation. It's actually in the Constitution. You have to provide compensation. But the government does have the authority for public use, and I'm going to get back to that term in a second, to take your property by eminent domain and use it for the public. So this is one of the many topics I teach in many of my classes. And when I teach over at the old building at the law school, which is at 34th and Chestnut, I actually get to invite my students to look out the window to where Domus is. Most of you know where Domus is, right? So in 1955, the University of Pennsylvania, with the assistance of the city, because the government has to condemn property, actually the Philadelphia Redevelopment Authority, which I'll get back to, condemned the property at 34th and Ludlow, which is now Domus. But here's what's interesting about this story that's related to your question about Judy. My mother lived in a house at 34th and Ludlow that was condemned by the city for Penn. Now, let me tell you a couple components of that. So that was a neighborhood that is referred to today. I think some people referred to it at the time as the Black Bottom. It was an African-American neighborhood, mostly poor African-American neighborhood that abutted the campus. And the university, working with the city, had decided that through eminent domain would facilitate the expansion of the campus. And actually in 1955, when they condemned the property, they said they were going to use it for a dorm. Now, one of the ironies, many ironies of this story is that a dorm was never built. It was a parking lot for 50 years, and then Domus was built. And so when I teach eminent domain, I actually can invite my students to look out and see the property where my mother grew up that was taken by the university for eminent domain. And I think that helps us understand the complicated relationship with the city. Now, I want to say a couple things. One, my mother, her family moved further west Philadelphia to a better house in a better neighborhood that actually provided a lot of positive things for her family. So my family story is actually not a negative one, even though the deeper relationship between Penn and the neighborhood in the 1950s and 1960s was pretty complicated.
Okay, so can I interrupt only because given your expertise, I want to add another element to the story, rather than fast forwarding to Judy Roden. So was the Science Center corridor, there's this thing called the Science Center, which owns almost all the property on Market 34th to 38th, is that correct?
Yes.
So that's a 60s deal.
Yes, that was also an urban renewal project.
And was that eminent domain as well?
It was, and it was also part of the Black Bottom.
So how do you feel about that whole thing? So that was an effort, an early effort at an innovation corridor, I guess, in West Philly?
Yeah. So if you think about it, the answer to your question is, of course, from what vantage point you're looking at it. So from the perspective of the many families who were uprooted, it's a at least complicated, if not mostly negative story. Again, my mother's family moved to a better house. And I think that's true for many people in that neighborhood. But it certainly resulted in the destruction of what is a historically vibrant by interpersonal relations neighborhood. It was actually a very poor neighborhood and a pretty economically challenged neighborhood, but a neighborhood that doesn't exist anymore. Now the city, in the post-war period, this is the city, not just Penn. The city believed that if the city was going to survive the economic transformation that was happening in the 50s and 60s, we needed to do things like do research around Penn and support economic development in new industries. Philadelphia is a very industrial place. Those industries were disappearing in the 1950s. So the city felt that it was a pretty important thing. And though you and I frequently talk about the challenges of the Science Center and our relationship, certainly it's produced economic benefits for the city, some of which have redounded to the West Philadelphia neighborhood, and certainly many that have redounded to Penn, right?
Okay, so that's the 60s. So then we fast forward to as I understand it, when Judy Roden became president, there was a big crime problem in West Philadelphia. I know you're really into urban universities, so at some point I want to ask you about that too. But you're an urban university. You've got crime or perceived crime, if not reality of crime, pretty close to your doorstep. And you've got these two choices. You've got build bridges or build walls. So how did that process work here, and how do you evaluate it 20 years later?
Okay. So just one more little bit of history, and I promise I'm going to get your question quickly. In the 1950s...
No, all the history. I don't know the history, so...
In the 1950s, the University of Pennsylvania bought a large tract of land in the Valley Forge area. And so Valley Forge is near King of Prussia Mall. If you took 76 west, you'd hit it in about it depends on how the traffic is. If you didn't have traffic, you'd hit it about 20, 25 minutes.
Right,
if you have usual traffic, it'd be 2 hours.
Yeah, okay.
But the university bought a large piece of land out there with the thought about moving.
Yeah.
And the university only sold that property about 10, 15 years ago. Not by that point, the decision not to move had been made, but still owned it for a meaningful amount of time. And so the university actually had considered moving out of the city of Philadelphia in the 1950s. To get to your question, in the 1960s and 70s, so let's start with the fact that the 1960s and 70s were a problematic time for this country, and actually in many ways for the world. Yeah. Just lots of conflict, lots of economic decline, turmoil, certainly lots of racial challenges. Then the 70s and 80s were a big problem for cities in the country in general. So it wasn't just Philadelphia. Cities were declining in general. Perfect example, New York City actually did need to get close to bankruptcy. Right. A little complicated, but we didn't get as close as New York did, but Philadelphia also got close. These things created challenges for the university, and certainly the neighborhood surrounding Penn in the 1970s into the 80s experienced a lot of crime. And
but the high rises behind us, they're 70s.
Yes.
So the university decided to go residential, but it didn't have there wasn't a lot of residential accommodation. They built these high rises, and now they're at 39th Street or wherever they are over here.
Yeah, and our university envelope is bigger than it was then. Right. They were at the edge. And getting to the dean's question, the university had a complicated relationship with the city and West Philadelphia in the 1970s and 80s. And in fact, if you look at much of the architecture for the buildings in that period, they do focus in. They do have somewhat of a fortress-like atmosphere compared to the buildings that we've built over the last 20 years. And so getting finally to President Rodin, so in 1994, President Rodin became president, and that was a particularly difficult year in terms of crime in Philadelphia, crime in West Philadelphia, crime connected to Penn. And as you said, as you framed it perfectly, the president and her leadership had a meaningful decision to make. So by then, they had decided not to move to Valley Forge. But the question is, how do we engage with the community in productive ways? And being actually President Rodin also grew up in Philadelphia, grew up in West Philadelphia. So it's not surprising that her strategy was to do a much deeper engagement, not to wall off, but to figure out how to engage in productive ways. And I think and getting back to my personal story, so my wife and I moved back to Philadelphia in 1993. So we actually were here right at the beginning of that. We bought a house in West Philadelphia in 1993, 6 months before President Rodin took office. And so our own personal experience was both with the challenges, even though I always want to say, as people frame this as West Philadelphia was a bad place then, it's a good place now. It was a lovely place to live in 1993. We were happy to move there. It was a fascinating place, but it's even more robust in 2019 than it was then. And I'm sure we'll get to some of the challenges, particularly in a business school class, about some of the challenges of economic development. Yeah. It creates its own challenges. But I always want to argue that those are good challenges. They're much better challenges than the city faced in 1970 when it was questioned about whether or not we were going to have to declare bankruptcy.
But she did what, again, this is, you live the history, I've only tried to understand it. So Penn invested in an elementary school, been incredibly successable, created incentive programs for faculty and staff to buy in West Philadelphia, successful. Are those the high points, or were there other things that, I mean, subsequently came a retail corridor out here, but that's much later.
Yeah, I would say that those are the highest profile things that Penn did in West Philadelphia. But actually, as I think about the most impactful things in West Philadelphia, I would point out some other ones. So building much more robust relationships with many schools. So the Penn Alexander School gets the most attention because it's actually got Penn in the name. Yeah. But in fact, Penn made a concerted effort to build relationships with many schools, mostly through the Netter Center for Civic Engagement. And so understand that the Netter Center just celebrated its 25th anniversary. So many of these things came together. And so that was a big part. Refocusing the university refocusing its effort on investing in West Philadelphia and Philadelphia. So being much more strategic about trying to build businesses in Philadelphia, in West Philadelphia and Philadelphia, allocating a lot more of the money that we spend for, basic things like maintenance, but paper, but also services. So the university now spends in a typical year over $200 million in West Philadelphia in buying services. And I think that that's dramatically higher than it was when so actually, as I think about the things that had the biggest impact again, the things you raise are the highest profile. But as I think about the things that are biggest impact, trying to actually build human capital and increase economic development, I think are the things that I think are more meaningful.
Okay, so we could talk only about your civic engagement and your roles in urban environments, university and education, but let's do a little bit about you as an intellectual. So you got into Yale Law School out of college, and you know that's a pretty hard place to get into, Yale Law School. You got through Yale Law, but then you wanted to do a PhD in history. I'm not sure how many people choose that path. So did you have that all planned out, or was it a pivot? I mean, you actually worked in the private sector for a little while, right? Nanosecond.
A little more than a nanosecond.
Okay, more than a nanosecond. I'm trying to be rhetorical here. What can I say? So Wendell went to Yale Law School and then came back to Penn to do a PhD in the history department.
So the answer to your specific question, it was not planned. And whenever students ask me to talk about my path, I say to them, you can't plan these things. I look for opportunities and looking for things that really excite me. This is how I made my decisions. So I went, graduated from college. I worked in DC for a couple of years for a congressperson. Everybody who has an interesting job, almost everybody is a lawyer. Almost everybody is. And so a lot of my thought process about going to law school was interest in government policy. Yeah. So I went to law school. And actually, to reply to another part of your question, as I look at my class in law school, actually a large number of us are academics. So
Yale Law School has more academics, I think, per capita, maybe in total, than any other law school.
Yeah, so actually, I'm not...
Very intellectual place.
I'm not that unusual for my class. There are a lot of academics in my class. But that was not my path. My expected path was to go work in government after law school. Uh-huh. And I've had lots of wonderful opportunities to either work in government or do public service while at Penn. But the pivot really was around a couple of things. So while I was in law school, I was a teaching assistant for a pre-law class, and I loved it. It was just a blast. And so, we described, my family and I told you my parents were teachers. Education is the family business, but I didn't realize it until I actually did it. So that was one thing. A second thing was an interest in urban policy, but a desire to understand it at a deeper level, which required going back to school yet again to understand things. And I'm honest, I try to be honest in general, but I try to be honest about my career path in academia. One of the things that's wonderful about being a faculty member, though not a dean or a provost, is that you have a fair amount of flexibility in your schedule. And there are lots of things that you can get involved in from being an academic. And one of the wonderful things about being a law professor is that people think that you know way more than you do. And they ask you to do lots of interesting things in public service. And so I had an inkling that taking the academic path would actually allow me to do things I love, teaching.
But you don't need to have a PhD to be a law professor. You can have a JD. Maybe most people now have JD PhDs.
Most people do have JD. We have a whole bunch of economists at the law school. Uh-huh. We have 5 historians. Uh-huh. We have 3 or 4 sociologists, a couple of psychologists. So we do have we have several philosophers. So we do have a lot of PhDs. I guess for me, though, it was mostly just a desire to understand more. I mean, that was my desire to go back to graduate school, was to understand more. I didn't feel like I understood enough.
So, but then almost immediately you wanted to put it into practice. So you did a lot of writing about, the intersection of law and urban development, eminent domain, what we've talked about, did New York, did Philadelphia. But very early on, you got involved in the school district world in Philadelphia. Something that you've done for almost 20 years, right? So the latest thing is you'll have to explain the transition in organizations, but the organization you were part of is no longer, and you've been involved in identifying a new leader for the new organization. But, public school districts, urban public school districts, this is not easy work, right? This is a labor of love. Politics are everywhere. Yeah. Outcomes are challenging. So talk about that a little bit, why you did it, yeah. What you did, why you were there, how you feel about public K-12 education.
Yeah. So I guess I'd start by saying, while you are right that if you define private sector fairly narrowly, I spent only a small amount of time in the private sector. But that experience in being on the School Reform Commission, which I'll get back to in a second, certainly gave me a lot of management experience, I gotta tell you. And it even prepared me for this job that I currently have in lots of ways, including very practical ones. So when I interviewed for the provost job, there was a very robust process. There were, first round, semifinalists, then the finalists, and then you start meeting with the president, and she's very detailed in her process. And so we had many meetings before she offered me the position. And one of the early meetings, she said, Wendell, the provost job is to say no a lot. Are you okay with saying no? And I said, well, Amy, this is an unfortunate thing, but I served 3 years, very difficult years on the School Reform Commission where we had to deal with a $600 million deficit. We had to lay off several thousand people. Luckily, we were able to bring back most of them. We had to close some schools. I think I'm comfortable with saying no. Yeah. And the president said, yeah, and we moved on from that question. Again, unfortunate that I had to gain that experience. But so I already mentioned that education is family business. Both my parents were school teachers. My mother is an English teacher, high school English teacher, taught at a million places. My dad is a musician who moved into administration fairly early, and when he retired, he was the director of the music programs for the whole school district and supervised over 1,000 music teachers. And so to answer your question is, I feel like I've been engaged with the school district.
So were they employed in the system while you were overseeing?
No, they both had retired.
And that was you had to do that? Would you not have been able to do it?
Yeah, I would not have done that. They had retired a decade before. Okay. But I've had experience thinking about with the school, just Philadelphia schools even as a kid. Now I would point out, you already heard this, the observant ones of you noticed that my parents worked for the public school system and they sent me and my sister to private school. So something to reflect on. My wife and I sent our kids to public school in Philadelphia, but complicated thing to talk about, which I'm happy to engage in. So I've been connected to public schools for a long time. Yes, so my first engagement as a professional with the public schools was working for the congressman who represented much of Philadelphia, who was trying to figure out how to get more resources to the schools, and so did a lot of engagement that way. I've had the pleasure and honor of serving on a lot of boards, one of which was the Community Legal Services of Philadelphia. I was the board chair, and we interacted in many ways with the school district. But to get to the experience that you referenced from 2011 to 14, I served as a member of the School Reform Commission, which was a state-created entity in one of our earlier rounds of challenges with public education.
But you were on the school board before that?
No, that is the school. Was the school board.
Okay.
So the School Reform Commission was created by the governor in 2000. It was a takeover of the school district. The state took over the school district when it was in financial crisis, an earlier time, and academic crisis. And the School Reform Commission had 5 members, 3 appointed by the governor, 2 appointed by the mayor. I was a mayor's appointee. And so we spent 3 very difficult years I've already framed out. The 4 of us, 4 new board members, started with a $600 million deficit. The superintendent had been fired, and we had to, in essence, rebuild the school system. Pretty difficult. And as a result of that, but also lots of other challenges, to get to the last part of your question, there was lots of agitation in the city to get rid of the School Reform Commission. Because understand this is a political relationship between the state and the city, and every other school district in the state of Pennsylvania and in most places in the country is run by the city, right? And again, by a 3-2 margin, the school district of Philadelphia was run by the state. Lots of agitation around that. So my response to that often usually was, well, I understand you, an individual, asking me about the SRC. I understand your concern. Actually, the 5 members of us, I think that we all live in Philadelphia, we all care about the school district. I'm not sure that as I list the problems in public education in Philadelphia, that the structure of the School Reform Commission was really high on my list of what the problems were.
But symbolically.
And so 2 years ago, the mayor, Kenny, who had campaigned, one of his priorities was getting rid of the School Reform Commission. And replacing it with the school board, which actually is appointed by the mayor. And 2 years ago, he succeeded in doing that, and I had the honor of leading the committee that made recommendations to Mayor Kenny for the new school board members. And there are lots of things that were great about that. There was a lot of work. One of the positive things was that I knew as chair, I was not going to recommend myself to be on the school board. So it was a good reason to be the chair, because I knew I wasn't going to have to do one.
This guy, he's so full of it. You just go for hard jobs. So you were willing to be go from Penn, maybe in the world of the Ivies, not the richest institution, but compared to most public universities, a very highly resourced institution. And you went from there to be Chancellor of Rutgers, but not Rutgers, New Brunswick, Rutgers, Camden, right? In an environment in which this is post-financial crisis, states are bailing out of higher education. You're not in the flagship campus, you're in an urban campus in a city that's got lots of challenges. So why did you do that?
It was an amazing opportunity. And I think we made a lot of progress, both for the campus and for the city, and I'm really proud of it. Yeah, it was very hard. I mean, it's the short answer to your question, because I know this is a group of people who are thinking about the career paths. The short answer to the question is the answer I give to a lot of questions about why did you do this? Because they asked me. And actually, I would say that I was completely underqualified, was grossly underqualified for that position. I had had the following experience. I had been the deputy dean of the law school, not even the dean of the law school. I had some meaningful political experience in the mayor's office, and I think that was relevant. But I went from being a deputy dean at Penn, where I helped the dean run a school of about 1,000 students and 50 faculty, to being the CEO of an organization that's, when I left, 6,600 students and 300 faculty.
Yeah.
And I was completely unqualified for that position, but they offered it to me anyway. And I think I learned on the job, and I think we made a lot of progress. But the answer to your question is because it seemed like a wonderful opportunity, a great challenge to make a difference in a place that really needed support.
When you signed on, had the state started to disinvest in the state universities, or was that a shock? How much did you know going in the door about what you were letting yourself in for in that job?
A fair amount. So there's several components to that question too. So the state of New Jersey has been for a long time deeply engaged with the city of Camden and provides a meaningful amount of resources to the city of Camden. That's the positive part. The problem is that the resources haven't been invested well. I think that actually the state and the city have gotten better over the last decade, so there was actually a fair amount of money that was going into the city of Camden, some of which we were able to partner and use to develop Rutgers Camden, which is why I'm saying it this way. So we, even though the answer to your question is right, that I knew going in that we were going to be pressed for support for the university from the state. That's just true, and we knew that going into it. And we had three difficult budgetary years. There were also opportunities to partner with the state in building Rutgers Camden as a campus in ways that benefited the city. So while there was, in one way we were losing resources, in another way we were actually able to take advantage of
gaining state resources. How did you do with non-state resources in your time at Rutgers Camden?
So this is another interesting part of the job. There have been lots of efforts to Camden, just to give you a little history, because I'm a historian, sorry for all the history lectures, but Camden is an amazing place. The phonograph was invented in Camden. Lots of other parts of radio technology were invented in Camden. Campbell's soup, so we all know Campbell's soup, but so Campbell's soup, it's just okay, right? But here's what's interesting about Campbell's soup. It was the first condensed product. It was created for World War I. So while you might not necessarily like Campbell's soup, the innovation in Camden just flabbergasted. And so for decades, Camden was a place that had way more jobs than it had people. And then in the 50s, the economy just collapsed. RCA, which was there, closed down. Campbell's moved a lot of their production out of the city. The Naval Shipyard closed down. And so just a gigantic challenge. Now, getting back to your question, the state, in response to that challenge, have been making investments, not very well thought out, and a lot of foundations have been making investments to try to help Camden recover. Also not particularly well thought out. And so our strategy, which was not mine, it's ours, and this was the political leaders, the leadership at Rutgers University, the foundation leaders, was try to build a human capital within the city. So invested in Rutgers Camden as an institution that would hopefully support more young people coming through the Camden School District. We made at Rutgers Camden deep investments in the schools in Camden. So we had students in every single school in Camden. We have faculty in every single school. We built a pipeline program that actually is finally bearing some fruit in terms of the number of actual kids from Camden who go to Rutgers Camden and then go out into the world and do good. So we did a lot of things. And they're actually, even though you're right, the number of the resources from the state to Rutgers were flat.
Oh,
We
flat,
actually,
not a big decline.
well, and part of the reason why there was not a big decline was because the state of New Jersey has historically not really invested in public education. So whereas there were some other places where it had gone up and gone down, Rutgers was kind of flat all the way.
Okay, so one more question about that. Did you, the Coalition of Urban Universities that you headed,
Headed.
Was that a new organization or had it existed for a long time?
No, so it was created also in the early 80s in the time of urban crisis.
Okay, so talk about your sense now. Let's leave Penn aside. Rich private university in an urban environment. Public universities in urban environments, more needed than ever, I presume.
Certainly.
But we have this irony to me about land-grant universities, which is most of the flagships are not in urban environments.
Yeah.
So tell me about the opportunity and challenge of public urban universities.
Yeah, so the Coalition of Urban and Metropolitan Universities is a coalition of about 100 universities across the country that are located in metropolitan areas, and particularly usually urbanized areas, but not only, that have made it a core part of their mission to engage with their communities. So that's self-selected group of 100 universities. It was created in the 1980s by a group of university presidents who realized that there was power in coalition around a lot of these issues. And one of the interesting things that you just alluded to is that there are lots of public universities like Rutgers Camden in urban areas, but they are not the flagships, right? So there's Wayne State in Detroit.
Morgan State, we celebrated our relationship with Morgan State in Baltimore, right?
Exactly.
Which is not the flagship of the University
But
of Maryland.
and Morgan State is part of the Coalition of Urban and Metropolitan Universities. And actually, I think a meaningful part of that coalition was to try to work together to get the flagship leaders to give more attention to the value of the urban universities.
Yeah.
And I would say to you that the coalition has had success on a lot of things, but I'm not sure it's had a lot of success on that specific question.
But the re-urbanization of the US, of course, over time is going to give those universities incredible opportunities that aren't so obvious if you're in a not rural, but a smaller town, college town environment. I'm very mindful that we want to get everyone involved in the conversation, and I certainly don't want to prejudge things that you'd like Wendell to speak about. So I'm only going to ask you one more bracket of questions. We've been talking for a long time, and I haven't used the L word, leadership. And I don't want to ask you a canned "what's your leadership style" question.
Thank you.
But I will ask.
It's very collaborative.
You're right. But I will ask you now, again, not what are your priorities as provost, but how do you think about a job in which the number of reports into your office? I feel like we've got a lot in the Wharton School. You exponent that to the university. How do you think about your job, not in the what are your priorities, but how you do the job, what it means to be a leader in a university environment, and how is that different from running the Education Commission?
Yeah, I think,
or being chancellor of Rutgers Camden. So you've got a lot of CEO kind of things here now. What ties them all together? What's different about your current gig?
Yeah, no, actually, I think
what does it mean for leadership? You'll have to use the L word.
Very good. So I think that there are many more similarities than differences. So I'll start with that.
Okay.
In terms of the core approach, the leadership principles by which you would I would approach these kind of questions. So a couple of just personal things and then get to your question. I remember strongly in high school, I went to a wonderful high school. I had lovely teachers, and I'm still in touch with many of them. And one of the many things that was great, because it was a small school, you could get this kind of attention. I remember, the faculty would meet with each one of us individually. And I remember junior year that the faculty, the teachers, my teachers, they got together and they said, Wendell, you're involved in too many things. You need to be involved in fewer things. And I did well in school, but they thought I could do even better. And so they said, you need to get rid of a few things. And I said, I like doing a lot of things. And so I didn't listen to them. And so why do I say that? Because I think that being a successful leader, it doesn't involve being a micromanager, but it involves several things. One, being able to see the bigger picture and how the different pieces fit together. But it does involve being very engaged with. I have 26 people that report to me. It involves being engaged with all of them and many other people to really move things forward. And mostly my job, so here's a difference between my current job and the other challenges that I've had the honor to be involved in. We're just blessed in so many ways at Penn. We're obviously blessed with resources, not as many as the dean said as some of our peers, but we have a lot of resources, but we're just blessed with amazing people. So my biggest challenge at work on a daily basis is that I have so many terrific people, they have so many great ideas, and even a place like Penn, we can't do all of them. And so the challenge is how to prioritize, figure out which ones that we can make the most progress on. And actually the hardest part of my job is letting down softly a person when we're not doing their idea. Because people are really ambitious here in a good way, and they really want to be successful. They really want to serve our students and grow our campus, and we have a million ideas and we can't do all of them. And so I would contrast that experience here with some of the earlier opportunities I've had, where I often work with wonderful people, but the number of ideas they had for how to solve problems were probably not as many. And often I had to initiate ideas. I actually don't even need to come up with any ideas at Penn, because again, my job is mostly to figure out how to pick the amazing ones among the amazing ones. So that's actually a biggest leadership challenge, I would say, in my current job.
So when we were in the same incoming dean class in 2014.
We were baby deans together.
We were baby deans together. You've aged much better than I. But being a dean is a sort of, I think about it as being like 50-50 external, internal.
Mm-hmm.
You've been an external person your whole life, but in your current job, you're more of an internal.
Yeah.
You said to me, I can always show up because I don't like you, I don't travel.
Yeah.
So how do you feel about that? Is there a muscle in your body that you're not exercising now, or there's not as big a difference between external constituencies and internal as some of us might think?
Yeah, I think that I would agree with your last statement, that actually the challenges are fairly similar, but I'm benefited by the fact that, unlike you, I don't have to travel to China every 6 weeks.
Yeah.
So I don't get the jet lag.
Even though you had a great trip to China.
I did. It was wonderful. It was wonderful. But I don't have to deal with the jet lag that you have to deal with frequently. Other than the travel, I'm not sure that there are a lot of differences between my job and yours. So yes, my job is all internal, but we have 26,000 students. We have over 40,000 people that work on campus. And then we have another 15,000 through Penn Medicine, Lancaster, Princeton, Westchester. So yeah, maybe it's all internal, but it's a pretty big internal.
Pretty big internal, okay. So we're 15 seconds over where I wanted to be.
Pretty good time management.
You're watching the clock.
Another pretty important skill.
So we like to open it up to anybody in the room. But I think since Wendell's not on the spot about policies at the university, it'd be good if you want to ask him a question about Penn, please do. But try to put it in a broader context, because I think we're really interested. I see Stephanie. I have line of sight to Stephanie Creary. Leading diversity is obviously an incredibly important theme for us. So if you can think about, if you want to ask Penn questions, try to make sure that they've got some broader resonance so we can have broader themes. Who'd like to go first? Always hard to go first. Yes, sir. We're going to go, hey, look at that. We got wonderful mic
Excellent.
monitors.
And maybe you could just say your name and
Yeah, tell
your
us where you're
relation to
coming
the-
from.
Yeah,
Stand up,
Your
tell
name.
us who you are.
yeah, who you are.
You got to hold the mic up, though. There
There
we
you
go.
go.
My name's Daniel. I'm from Miami. I'm
Excellent.
a freshman.
Excellent. Nice to meet you, Dan.
And I was just wondering your experiences with diversity and inclusion in the workplace currently, but as your role shifted in society from an educator to now a professional at one point in the corporate sector, and how you engage with that.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, because I think it's implicit in a lot of things that we
Yep.
discussed, but now we can make it a little bit more explicit. So I'll start with the President Gutman's statement that excellence and diversity are complementary. In fact, they are required. You can't have excellence without diversity. And I'll just describe that and buttress that point in a couple of ways. So this university has become more excellent as it's become more diverse. Those two things are deeply intertwined. And I'm very proud for the president and President Rodin before his leadership in making us an excellent university and acknowledging that, understanding that being diverse is a crucial part of that. Actually the crucial part of it. So now I'll go way back to a little bit more history, and I was thinking about this question as I walked up here. So I spent a lot of time studying the history of urban policies, and I mentioned a couple. And as I look at those histories, and of course, lots of the people who developed urban policies around eminent domain and urban renewal were well-intentioned. But actually, I think probably the core problem with how they implemented those ideas is that they didn't include a diversity of perspectives. Right? Nobody went and asked my mother's neighbors what they thought about what should happen in the Black Bottom, right? And so I think as I look as a historian at past practice, I think we can see lots of examples of where we didn't reach out to diverse perspectives and diverse backgrounds, really caused us gigantic problems, some of which we're still trying to get out of, right? So again, today I think we've seen the positive reactions. Of course, we have lots of challenges with diversity. I'm going to get to a couple of them in a second. But I think we made a lot of progress as an institution in recognizing that, in fact, a lot of the decisions that were made earlier were flawed because we didn't actually get different perspectives. So, as I think about the challenges today, we certainly have challenges at Penn in the professional world in general with the numbers, meaning when we actually look at our faculty, our student body, our staff, when other organizations look at them, and I'm really happy to look in this room and actually see tons of diversity, but we're nowhere near where we need to be in terms of the numbers. So there's tons of work to do. And I'll say one more thing about President Gutman. She's very focused on the numbers. There isn't a meeting that she and I have where we aren't talking about the diversity in many different ways of our faculty, student body, and our staff. So she has a laser-like focus on that, and therefore I do too. But that's one big challenge. But another challenge, and actually I will reflect on this in my current job, we use terms, diversity, inclusion, belonging. All of these are important. They change over time. But as I think about a big challenge in the last 2 years on the job, is really the belonging has become even more important. So as you become more diverse, that's a good thing. But if people don't actually feel part of the community, then you haven't actually succeeded. And so, the numbers are important, but they're just the beginning. Actually creating a sense of belonging and a sense of responsibility for all members to be, I'm using all the words, inclusive, is actually a big part, I think, of my job and the provost's office job. And I'll just give an example. So as we think about retaining our faculty, we have a wonderful, diverse faculty. Again, we could get better, but through President Gutman's leadership, we've become more diverse. Here's the challenge. A lot of our peers now have recognized that diversity and excellence go hand in hand, and they're trying to steal our faculty. And so one of my every one of us has priorities, and retention of faculty is one of our big priorities. President measured us on how successful we are at retaining faculty or made offers in other places. And we've been very successful, but I'll just give you an example, and this is, again, something I've learned through my interaction with the Wharton School. So one of the things I think you probably know, because you're connected to the school, is that it takes many positive interactions to overcome a negative interaction, right? Psychologists, marketing people, brand people have made this clear, right? And so negative interactions have an oversized impact on people's experiences. And so I've had several conversations with faculty in the last 2 years in trying to retain them when they'll bring up something that really troubled them that actually happened 6 or 7 years ago. And so we've made, and even they might acknowledge that we made a bunch of progress, but that thing still sticks, right? And so we have to recognize that, right? I mean, we're only going to be successful if we actually create a sense of belonging for everybody that is stable and long-lasting, because we're going to lose great people if we don't do that. So and I could talk a lot more, but I want to take a few more questions. But I appreciate you asking the question.
Should we go one on
you-
each side of the room? Is there another, Jen, have you want to give this gentleman here the mic?
Hi, my name's Jonathan Nurnberg. I'm a senior. My question's more around, have you found your identity's been compromised or struggled with expressing your own opinions as your identity, or as your position has become more political, from dean to provost or chancellor, things like that?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. And it's a question that students ask frequently. And I'll answer it from a couple of perspectives. So one, I think if you're a sentient person and you look around the world and you see all of the challenges that we have, you can't, by nature, you have to be conflicted. Let's start with that. I mean, I think that anybody is aware, and I would say I've been deeply blessed in my life, and I think almost everybody in this room has been blessed in some ways, though we have different stories. But if you're aware of the disparities and all of the problems that we have in this world, you have to be troubled by it. Let's start with that, right? Two, and I'm not trying to privilege my experience as a person of color, but that is my experience. If you're a person of color, you have to be particularly troubled with all of the challenges that we have, right? Continue to have. Even when you can recognize that we've made progress. And as I am lucky to have historic perspective, and I think we made a lot of progress, but we got just a ton of challenges, right? So I framed to answer your question that way because I think that what you've asked is true about everybody, okay? But yes, to answer your question, it's certainly a challenge for me. Now, I would say, I'll get more narrow focused on your question. I have not in any job had the experience where I disagreed so vehemently with a core principle, a decision that it conflicted with a core principle that I had. I've never had that experience. And I know why I've never had that experience, because if I had that conflict, I would have quit. So I've been fortunate that I haven't been presented with the core tension. But yeah, every single day. I mean, every single day, again, I think personally, first of all, how blessed I am and that the opportunities and the resources I have. I think about how blessed we are at Penn and all of the resources that we have. I think constantly about the fact that we should be figuring out as much as possible to share those resources and expose lots of other people to the blessings that we have. So I think about it constantly. I mean, I would say there's nothing more that motivates me than that conflict. So to wrap up my answer to your question, yes, I feel it on a daily basis, pretty much every hour in some way. But I do think that the answer to that question, and this wasn't what you asked, but the answer to that question isn't to step back and say, well, because I'm going to have these conflicts, I shouldn't engage. The answer is to say, well, yes, these are the challenges and we have to dig in on them. And what I try to do, for my own personal mental health is to every day and every week and every month, both acknowledge the problems, but also celebrate the things that went well, celebrate the things that we made progress on. And that's how I'm able to deal with that conflict. I think that was your question, was that?
Can I ask you a follow-up on that?
Okay.
Academy Awards follow-up.
Okay.
Did you see Spike Lee's reaction to Green Book?
Oh, no, I fell asleep by then. What did he do?
This was...
I saw his reaction when he won.
On the red carpet after, he had his Academy Award in one hand and a glass of champagne in the other hand, and somebody asked him, "What do you think about the fact that Green Book won, Perens and Black Klansman did not win?" And his reaction was something like, "Every time there's a driving movie, it beats me." Because he was thinking about Do the Right Thing, which is...
And lost to Driving Miss Daisy, is that right?
Against Driving Miss Daisy in '89 or whenever that was. And I certainly thought that Do the Right Thing was just a profoundly powerful movie, incredible movie at the time. And then he had to make a joke about it
Yeah.
because he said, I was like, when my Knicks get a bad call in basketball, you just, you complain
on.
about it and you move on.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I mean, implicitly he was talking about mainstreaming of racial issues in the United States versus a more authentic rendering.
Yeah.
So how do you feel about that in an elite American university context?
Yeah. No, so I didn't see Green Book, and actually I didn't see it.
I haven't seen Green Book either. I love Black Klansman,
Yeah.
but not as
Yeah.
much as Do the Right Thing, which to my mind is just an incredible movie.
And one of the reasons why I didn't see it, because I said it seemed like Driving Miss Daisy. So that was one of the reasons why I didn't see it.
But flipped, right? All we did
yeah,
was...
but
all we
flip.
did
But come
was-
on, that's
Yeah,
and
okay.
so I agree with the way you framed it, and I think that this is a challenge at an elite institution that we need to be very wary and careful about patting ourselves on the back too often. Again, I think we need to acknowledge progress that we've made. What I tend to do, and this is another leadership tool, I tend, when faced with the multiple challenges that we have, to try to frame them by thinking about what is working, not because it denies what isn't working, but it helps us think about how we might use those lessons to figure out how to improve. So I mean, that is kind of my framework for thinking about things. But I think the point that you just raised is, yeah, we need to be careful about being too self-congratulatory about the progress that we made. When again, if you look at the world, we just have a ton of work to do.
Great. So we're back to this side where there were lots of hands. You want to choose somebody? Hey, you got all the power. You got the mic. You have lots of power.
I always respect people sitting in the front row, even though, by the way, I never did in college, but I respect people that do as a teacher.
Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm a senior. And you were talking earlier about like the numbers aren't enough. You need to have a workplace where everyone feels like they can be themselves and like feel included in that way. I want to know a little bit more about your personal experience at Penn and also in your other work experiences. So you obviously have a lot of differences from your coworkers. You grew up here, maybe some others didn't. Do you feel like that's something that strengthens your work, either at Penn or in previous jobs that you have? Is that something that lets you bring new perspectives to the table, or do you ever find yourself kind of minimizing those differences that you have to seem more palatable to anyone?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and something I think about a lot, and I haven't resolved it within myself. So I'm going to give you a somewhat convoluted answer, but that doesn't mean it's not an excellent question. So again, let me tell a little story that I was going to tell earlier, and we jumped into other great conversations. So I grew up in Society Hill. Society Hill is near where the Liberty Bell is. And we moved there. We moved to the house that my parents still live in 1970. And last year, so my work is in urban policy. It's around things like housing discrimination. And last year, some colleagues and I organized a conference at Penn to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. And I'm getting to your answer. I promise there's a connection. So at that conference, one of the things I talked about was the fact that my family was recruited to move to this house in Society Hill because of the Fair Housing Act. Because the real estate developer of the housing realized that he had some legal obligation to have some diversity in the community that he was getting some federal funding to build. And so a couple of things about that personally. One, I grew up, we were the only black family on the block. Two, for you Wharton people, that was a wonderful investment that my parents made because they bought a house in Society Hill in 1970 that's worth a lot more than it was when they paid. And actually that paid for my sister and I to go to college and lots of other things. So and I point that out to say what a wonderful policy impact the Fair Housing Act had on us. But now let's talk about some negative things. 50 years later, the Pritchards are still the only black family on the block. So that points out some of the challenges that we have at a personal level. But to answer your question, I've been used to, and my sister, we've been used to being the only black people. I mean, I think that's true about my parents. And in most of my interactions throughout most of my life, I've been the only person of color and the only black male specifically in lots of interactions. So I've just gotten used to that. I've actually, again, historical context matters, my experience today is much more robust and diverse than my growing up experience. So from my perspective, just the things, this room is wonderful, right? Because my experience was being the only black person. Now, to add a little bit more color to answer your question, I I have lots of friends who have also had the experience of being the only Black person. And we talk about this frequently. And we have had, that group have had different ways of interacting with that experience. My experience has been generally very positive. And so I look back on how my life has developed, and I've generally interacted with people who were very supportive, who were interested in my opinion. I took it seriously, I think. And so as I reflect back, even though it was awkward, it was also very positive. So to finally answer your question, I'm just used to it. And so I don't go into experiences expecting that there's going to be a problem or expecting that people aren't going to care about my view. But I also know there are lots of other people who haven't been blessed the way I have and have had that experience. And so I'm still cognizant as I interact with other people to recognize that there are structural hierarchies that prevent some people from engaging. So my challenge now, of course, is everybody on campus listens to me now. I'm the boss. So I don't have that problem anymore.
As you say, your jokes have become a lot funnier.
Yes, exactly. I am much more popular now. So I don't have that problem at all anymore. But what I think, to finally wrap up and I told you it was going to be a rambling answer to your question. To wrap up my rambling answer to your question, I think I try to be cognizant of other people's experiences that they might not have been as positive as mine have been, and therefore try to be inclusive in meetings, try to be aware of who's participating, who's not, who's been affirmed, whose statements have been affirmed, who haven't been affirmed, so that we can therefore go forward. But again, my personal experience has been pretty positive.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Another question? Yes, right here in the back row. I don't know whether.
I don't know if I need a microphone. Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. My name's Ellen. I'm a first-year MBA.
Nice to meet you.
And I guess I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more on a granular level about kind of as you're shepherding the university towards more emphasis on diversity and inclusion, the stakeholder management involved and how you engage with the different stakeholders from like the donors to the administration and kind of what that experience has been like for you and some tools that you've used to optimize it.
Yeah, thank you. That's another excellent question. Not a surprise, but a lot of good questions. So that I do think that, for one, that's a big part of the job, is recognizing and engaging lots of different stakeholders who probably have different views. So let's just acknowledge that. I would say in the 2 years I've been in the job, and this of course could change, and it will go up and down, I've been really proud. I frequently use the word alignment. How aligned are we? And actually, I would say that there's much more alignment among the different stakeholders about the importance of diversity than there is disalignment. I don't think I've had an argument with anybody of all the different groups of stakeholders about the importance of diversity. And that's nice, because actually I would have expected going into the job at least a small number of people who would be questioning the philosophical framework that I'm talking about. And actually I haven't had that experience at all. So again, I think that's positive. Now, the devil is in the details, and certainly there are a fair amount of agreements about how to promote diversity and how to create inclusion and a sense of belonging. And certainly there are people who think that we should be moving faster than others. That one, that's not really a challenge for me, because whenever people say we should be doing more, we should be moving faster, my response is one sentence: I agree. So I don't really feel a need to be defensive or argue with people who say that. And then my second answer is, all right, so how do you think we can do that? So I guess I'll wrap up my answer to your question is by saying you are right that it's important for us to get lots of stakeholder engagement, and it's important for us to talk about where we agree and where we disagree. But there's a lot more agreement than there is disagreement. And I guess the last thing I would say is, and this is actually one of the reasons why I was interested in the job, because my deep respect for President Gutmann, and she has been talking about the importance of diversity since and I read her first speech when she was appointed. And I would describe it this way: she has beaten it into this institution that how important this issue is. So that makes my job easier. Because there really isn't anybody arguing against the philosophy at this point here. While again, there certainly are people who are arguing about how we should go about it.
Excellent. Another question, hands left. We've got 9 minutes according to the countdown clock.
Hey.
Wait 1 second, we'll get you a mic.
Hi, my name is Rob. I'm a second-year MBA. Following up on that last question, there's a lot of different ideas out there about how to improve diversity and inclusion. And you said the debates are more about how. Who do you consult, or how do you go about parsing which strategies are going to be the most effective and which are maybe, adding additional complexity but not necessarily effectiveness to improving diversity within the university?
So I have a very easy, short answer to your question. I'll give a long one. The short answer is I talked to that lady over there, Joanne Mitchell, who happens to be our Chief Diversity Officer. And so that's the short answer to the question. But the longer answer, and it's through particularly Joanne's leadership, but others is, we do a lot of interacting with peers. So we had a wonderful conference last October, September? Yeah, about institutional diversity, and we brought 100 provosts and presidents from all around the country and even a few from abroad to talk about how do we advance this work. And we spent 2 days together talking about a lot of different aspects of it. It was mostly around faculty diversity, but it wasn't only about faculty diversity. So we talk a lot with our peers. What are you doing? How have you approached this challenge? We bring in lots of expertise. We're really blessed to have Stephanie, who has given us lots of advice about a lot of these different questions, Professor McCreer, sorry. And so we do a lot of different things. I would say this is one of the areas among many where we actually have a lot to learn from the business community. So another thing that I know the dean does is bring in lots of advisors, many of whom are our alums, to help think about these questions. So we do a lot of things to get ideas. Second part of your question was how do we prioritize? That's a harder thing to answer. And I'm interested, and I won't call on you to add anything, Joanne, but you can give me feedback later. I would say that we try a ton of things and try to measure quickly whether or not they're working, and then try to focus on the things that seem to be working. But I don't know that we necessarily have an overarching strategy about how to prioritize among the ideas. Is that a fair thing to say? 15, so she's been president for almost 15 years. And again, President Rodin was also focused on this issue, but I think we made a lot of advances under President Gutman's leadership. But it's still a relatively new thing, and as I think about, and again, I've learned from your professor, we're just still learning a lot about what works. And we're also learning a lot about what doesn't work. And so, I think we have to be very experimental.
Can I ask a question of people in the room? Hands up how many people